Hi everyone, welcome back to Guild Index. This episode is the Impressionists were the original startups. I begin as always with the index. So in April of 2026, a Monet painting that had been sitting in a private collection for 115 years resurfaced at Sotheby's in Paris, and it sold for 6.5 million euros, smashing its pre-sale estimate. And buried in the provenance record, almost as a footnote, a very minor detail, was the last place it had been seen before it disappeared. And it was on the walls of Paul Durand-Ruel's Fifth Avenue gallery here in New York in the early years of the 20th century. Durand-Ruel, the man who was kind of the focal point of this entire episode, he lent Monet 20,000 francs to buy his home in Giverny in France in 1890, and he stored paintings by artists nobody wanted to see in a warehouse in Paris for years, waiting for the world to kind of catch up and see his vision and see what he saw in the artist and the art itself. And one of those paintings spent 115 years in a private collection and came back to market this spring with his name still attached to it, like a hallmark and almost like a guarantee. That is the index, and that is the argument. What Durand-Ruel built was not just a career, it was a market, and he invented the conditions under which a Monet can sell for 6.5 million euros in 2026 with his name still in its provenance. And the way he did it looks, from where we are now here in 2026, exactly like a startup story. The monopoly to disrupt, the product nobody believed in, the near bankruptcy, and the woman that history books tend to forget about. Finally, the pivot and the return that made it all worth it. The VC market in Q1 in 2026 invested over $300 billion into a little over 6,000 startups globally. It was a record, the highest level of venture investment of any quarter in history. And the dominant story inside that record is bifurcation. The SVB State of Market report describes the current environment as surgical. It follows a strict kind of procedure and it's very meticulous. The money is going to a small number of things the people that are writing the checks believe in completely, against the prevailing consensus, and are willing to hold through the hard part. And what's very cool about this is Paul Durand-Ruel was doing this in Paris in 1871 with oil paintings nobody wanted, and nobody even wanted to see, really. And every mechanism used to build the Impressionist market exists in some form in the venture capital industry right now. That man was really running pre-seed rounds in 19th century France, and he did not really have the language for it, but I do, and I want to walk through exactly how he did it, including the parts of the story that I feel like get left out often, and which it's very interesting. Like the tiny little details that do get left out are, I feel like, the most interesting part. The Paris Salon as a monopoly. So to understand what Durand-Ruel was disrupting, you kind of have to understand the Paris Salon not just as a cultural institution, which that it is, but also as a market structure. The Salon was founded in 1667 under King Louis XIV, and by the 19th century, it was really the only legitimate venue for a French painter to exhibit and sell their work to collectors. A Salon medal was a commercial guarantee. Winners received government commissions, private portrait work, collector attention, and artists excluded from the Salon really had no path to market. It was a total, monopoly over credit and distribution, and the jury that ran it was composed of academy painters whose aesthetic values were extremely rigid. All they really cared about was finish, polish, historical, accuracy, historical subjects, the suppression also of visible brushwork, and we know that is what Impressionists were obviously famous for, and kind of the illusion of effortless mastery. You know, like they wanted to see the work that you learned, you know, painted and sprawled out on a canvas. And everything the Impressionists were doing was really the exact opposite of what the Salon was looking for. In 1863, the Salon rejected 2/3 of all work submitted. It was a little over 3,000 works. So think of Monet, Pissarro, Whistler, and Cézanne. So Napoleon III ordered a parallel exhibition called Salon des Refusés, and a critic named Louis Leroy looked at Monet's impression. It was Sunrise, and used the word impressionist as an insult. It was considered unfinished, almost like an amateur could do it. It was really not serious to him and a lot of people within the Salon. And they kept the name. The insult really became the label and the brand itself, and this is the oldest startup story there is. The incumbent controls access and the disruptors really cannot get in, so they take the criticism and make it their identity. What I find intriguing about the Salon specifically is it just did not, you know, control who could sell. It controlled who could also be taken seriously. And that mattered enormously for the women in this story, because the Salon's gatekeeping was not only aesthetic, it was also gendered. The system that excluded the Impressionists for their brushwork excluded women really for their existence. Durand-Ruel disrupted both simultaneously, and I feel like that is not a coincidence, and it is the most interesting thing about him. Durand-Ruel, the original venture capitalist. Paul Durand-Ruel was born in 1831 to an art dealing family, one could say, you know, kind of an original Nepo baby. And by the time he encountered the Impressionists seriously in the 1870s, he had a gallery in Paris that also had branches in London and Brussels. And he also had a real client network. He was taken seriously and he had standing. He really did have something to lose, and he decided to go all in. What all in looked like is worth being pretty specific about. So first, monthly stipends were in exchange for first rights to all new work, and there was also an advance against future output. He was structuring exclusivity agreements the way kind of like a record label would sign artists. And the Philadelphia Museum's 2015 catalog on Durand-Ruel documents this really accurately and precisely. He signed multiple artists simultaneously and paid them kind of consistently even when he could not sell the work. Second is he bought in bulk. I do not mean, you know, one or two paintings to test the market. Over a career, he accumulated over 1,000 Monets, 1,500 Renoirs, 800 Pissarros, and more than 12,000 works in total. He really did corner the market on asset class that had not really recognized the market. He was accumulating inventory in something nobody else really believed in, and also nobody really believed it was worth accumulating. Third, and this is I think the move that distinguishes a venture capitalist from a speculator, is he did not really flip when things got hard. He stood by his artists and the art that they produce, and he stored thousands of paintings for years, sometimes even decades, waiting for the market to catch up to his thesis and his kind of vision for the art and the artists themselves. The Irish Times piece on him quotes Renoir, describing him as a missionary for whom painting was a religion. This is kind of the most accurate description of conviction investing I have ever read. For the fourth thing is he manufactured the intellectual context. So he actually commissioned writers, including Stéphane Mallarmé, to produce catalog essays, and he organized solo exhibitions to build individual artists' reputations up when that really was not a common practice in the art world. And he created the critical apparatus that made the works legible. So TechCrunch is reporting on what VCs require from founders in 2026 is kind of striking in this context because it draws a lot of parallels. So the current consensus is that founders must prove a distribution advantage, not just a good product, but truly a distribution advantage. And Durand-Ruel solved exactly this for the Impressionists. They had extraordinary product, but they had no distribution, and he built a parallel distribution system from scratch. Actually, by the 1880s, he was nearly bankrupt. He had borrowed money heavily. Exhibitions in Berlin, London, Boston, and Rotterdam were all failures. His Paris gallery was described as an insane asylum, and he was holding thousands of paintings he himself could not sell at the prices that he believed that they were worth. And then the pivot came, and it partly came because of the women. The women, the part nobody tells you about. Here's the part of the Durand-Ruel story that I think, genuinely is unexplored, and that changes kind of the whole shape of it. History remembers Durand-Ruel, saving the Impressionists, but nobody talks about the woman that ended up saving Durand-Ruel, and that is a significant omission. Morisot was the only woman at the founding 1874 Impressionist exhibition, the first one at Nadar's studio on the Boulevard des Capucines. 31 artists, 165 works, and she was there. She actually ended up showing 10 paintings, and she had started selling through Durand-Ruel the year before in 1873. Before the movement really even had a name, the scholarly record on this is very specific again, and her work sold well from the start. The market was ready for her before the critics even were. What the critics were saying about her is obviously something that I want to bring up. Le Figaro's Albert Wolff, reviewing the 1874 exhibition, described the Impressionists as about 5 or 6 lunatics, of which one was a woman, whose feminine grace is maintained amid the outpourings of a delirious mind. He obviously meant it as an insult. He was calling her work deranged and calling her an anomaly in the same sentence. And she kept going, she kept pushing forward. She participated in every Impressionist exhibition but one between 1874 and 1886. And she exhibited under her full maiden name at a time when women in public life routinely, obscured their identities. She chose to be visible. That is a decision with consequences, and she made it deliberately. When she ended up passing in 1895 at the age of 54, Durand-Ruel held her retrospective over 400 works. He really believed in her enough to memorialize her, and the market he had built for her work ended up outlasting her. And then there's Mary Cassatt, the only American in the Impressionist group. Degas himself actually invited her to exhibit with them, which really does matter because Degas was notoriously difficult and did not extend any invitations lightly, and Durand-Ruel eventually purchased over 400 of her works, and he brought her work to New York in 1886 to American collectors, to her own country, before her own country really even knew who she was. But here is the detail that the free space on Cassatt documents, and I think it needs to obviously be said very clearly. Before the 1886 New York show, when Durand-Ruel was nearly out of money and extremely desperate, Mary Cassatt materially saved him. She provided him financial assistance, and she ended up giving her address book out to him, full of the American collectors that she knew personally. The Havemeyers, the Potter Palmers, and Alexander Cassatt, her own brother. These were the people who became very foundational buyers for the Impressionist work in America. These were the collectors whose acquisitions now form the core of major American museum collections. Cassatt did not just participate in the movement, she funded the pivot that saved it. So the story that gets told is Durand-Ruel believed in the Impressionists when nobody else did and saved them from obscurity. That story is obviously true, But the story that does not really get told is Mary Cassatt believed in Durand-Ruel when nobody else would and saved him from bankruptcy. And Berthe Morisot was presented at the founding, you know, built her market from the start and had a Durand-Ruel retrospective when she died. These women were not really passengers in the startup. They were, you know, not in the back seat. They were load bearing. And here's the observation that I would like to put on record. The Impressionist movement is described in the scholarly literature as the first affirmatively and consistently egalitarian art movement. You know, women were involved in the organization, promotion, and exhibitions from 1874 and onwards. This is not really just a footnote, a minor detail. This is a structural fact about how the movement operated. Durand-Ruel's decision to represent Morisot and Cassatt was not just a personal belief in their talent, it was a bet on a completely different idea of who counted as a serious artist. And the market he built really did ended up validating that bet. They are in the permanent collections of the Met, the Musée d'Orsay, the Art Institute of Chicago, and their auction records keep climbing. The women he believed in when the Salon obviously would have not, are now blue chip, and that is what a conviction bet looks like when it really does pay off completely. The pivot and the return. So it's 1886 and Durand-Ruel is nearly out of money. James Sutton at the American Art Association approaches him with a proposition: bring the Impressionists to America. Durand-Ruel later said that he had been considered mad, like insane, for trying to sell what was, you know, seen as quote-unquote degenerate art, and that he really did have nothing left to lose. And that is a very great description of a pivot. Durand-Ruel sailed to New York with 300 paintings. The show transferred to a larger venue to accommodate the very large crowds. The second New York show in 1887 sold 225 paintings. The American market opened up completely, and the reason it worked is the most interesting part of it. American collectors in the 1880s were industrialists. They were new money, you know, Gilded Age wealth, and they had not grown obviously up in the academy tradition. They had not been trained to see visible brushwork as incompetence. They looked at Impressionists and saw something beautiful and immediate and new, and they had the resources to really act on that perception. The product had not changed, but the audience had. This is a product market fit, and Durand-Ruel figured it out in 1886 by putting paintings on a ship and sailing them to New York. And crucially, those American collectors were in part Cassatt's people. You know, she had really cultivated those relationships. She had introduced them to the work itself. The Havemeyers, whose collection is actually now the core of the Met's French painting holdings, came to Impressionism through her. The pivot worked partly because she had laid that groundwork and that foundation. So this is what we call now warm introductions, and she was doing it in 1885. Monet said it plainly in 1918. Without Durand-Ruel, we would have died of hunger. We owe him everything. What Monet did not say, because he probably did not fully know, is what Cassatt had done to make that debt possible to repay. So before he died in 1922, Durand-Ruel said, "My madness had been wisdom. To think that had I passed away at 60, I would have died, you know, debt-ridden and bankrupt, surrounded by a wealth of underrated treasures." He almost did die actually at 60. He had a heart attack in 1870. He survived and he lived to be 90. And he lived long enough to see a Monet sell for prices he could not have imagined when he was storing those canvases in a Paris warehouse. The auction record for a Monet is 110.7 million. It was set at Sotheby's in 2019 for the haystack mural from 1890. Durand-Ruel actually bought comparable works in the 1870s for a few hundred francs. The SVB State of Market report for H1 in 2026 describes the current venture environment as one where convictions concentrated at the very top are being, rewarded. Fewer deals and bigger checks. The best outcomes going to the investors who made the most committed bets on the fewest things. And this is structurally what Durand-Ruel did. He did not diversify across 20 different art movements. He concentrated everything on one thing that everyone else thought was wrong. He made a conviction bet and he held through, near bankruptcy and public ridicule for 15 years. The Impressionist market today is one of the most stable categories in the entire art world. ArtNet describes it as exhibiting one of the lowest levels of volatility across major collecting categories. It's almost a safe harbor. The works Durand-Ruel bought as speculation are now the blue chip holdings. He did not just create a market, he created a category of stability. And in the April 2026 Monet that came back to auction after 115 years, with his gallery's name in the provenance, is the proof of that. His name is still doing, the work 100 years after his death. His judgment is still the hallmark. No venture fund in Silicon Valley has matched that track record. So that was Gilt Index episode 3, the Paris Salon as a monopoly, Durand-Ruel as the venture capitalist who nearly went bankrupt, the women who were load-bearing and almost always get written out of the story, and New York in 1886 as the product market fit moment, and a Monet that came back to auction in April 2026 with his name still in the provenance, 100 years after his death, still doing work. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next week. Bye!